Cops humiliated a poor black woman in Times Square, unaware the Korean Mafia boss was watching. The first thing I felt wasn't the cold steel of handcuffs. It was the heat. Not just the stifling, 92-degree humidity of a New York July that makes the air in Times Square taste like exhaust and roasted peanuts, but the aggressive, localized heat of Officer Thorne's hand clamping down on my bicep. I am Zoraide Vance, and at 9:47 p.m., I became a ghost in the brightest place on earth. I wasn't a criminal. I was a Juilliard dropout with a taped-up 1998 cello and a mother who needed her insulin by morning. I had been busking near the TKTS red steps, those glowing glass stairs that represent the pinnacle of Broadway dreams, playing Bach's cello suite No. 1. It is a piece that usually brings people peace, a moment of resonance in a city that only knows how to scream. But in this city, peace is a permit you can't always afford. I was packing up, carefully sliding my bow into its worn velvet sleeve, when the blue and red strobes began to dance off the wet pavement. The lights were hypnotic, fractured by the rain-slicked asphalt into a disorienting neon nightmare. "Don't move, Vance," Thorne growled. He didn't just grab me, he pinned me. I could feel the individual pressure of his fingers bruising the skin under my denim jacket. He was heavy-set, his uniform straining against a torso fueled by precinct coffee and a god complex. Beside him, Officer Miller leaned in so close I could smell the stale, burnt acidity on his breath and the metallic scent of his badge. "Zone 3 permit, Zoraide," Miller whispered, his voice a terrifying, intimate contrast to the screaming sirens behind him. "You're soliciting without a license. That's a Class B misdemeanor. Or maybe we just call it resisting and see how fast you hit the ground." It was a lie. I had my paperwork tucked in the side pocket of my case, but Thorne had already kicked my open cello case toward the subway grate. I watched, helpless, as the few $5 bills I'd earned, my mother's lifeblood, scattered into the dirt and grime of the 7th Avenue gutter. They were squeezing my arm, physically and metaphorically, waiting for a flinch. They wanted a reaction so they could justify the violence they had already pre-written in their heads. This is the compliance trap, the psychological tactic of using physical provocation to force a non-compliant movement. I looked around for a witness, a savior, a human being. What I saw was a digital coliseum. A wall of tourists stood 10 feet back, their faces obscured by the glowing rectangles of their iPhones. Nobody was calling for help. Nobody was shouting for them to stop. They were adjusting their focus, hunting for the perfect high-definition angle of my humiliation to feed their social media feeds. I wasn't a person to them. I was content. I was viral trauma in a denim jacket. To them, my struggle was just a background track for their vacation vlog. The helplessness was a physical weight, heavier than the hand on my arm. But then, my eyes locked onto someone who wasn't holding a phone. Standing amongst the sea of frantic tourists and glowing screens was a man who seemed to exist in a different time zone. He was positioned near the edge of the barricade, wearing a long, dark wool trench coat that looked entirely too expensive for a humid night in the square. He stood perfectly still, a pillar of shadow against the neon chaos. His jawline was a sharp edge of granite, and his eyes weren't on a phone screen. He was staring at Officer Thorne's nameplate, then Miller's. His name, though I didn't know it then, was Shim Baek-du. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a predator watching two scavengers mess with something they didn't understand. While the crowd filmed my face, Baek-du was memorizing the identities of the men who thought they were the highest authority in the room. He wasn't part of the Coliseum. He was the one who owned the arena. The injustice was peaking. Thorne's grip tightened until I felt my shoulder click. The tourists leaned in, waiting for the money shot of me being tackled. But Baek-du simply reached into the pocket of his coat. He didn't pull out a phone. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a silent, absolute authority that was about to turn Times Square into the site of a very public execution of a career. The cops thought they were arresting a nobody. They were actually beginning the last 20 minutes of their professional lives. Before we begin this story of how a single silent observer flipped the script on corruption, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep enjoying awesome stories like this. Your support helps us tell the stories the news won't cover. Thank you. The world didn't go quiet. It went jagged. Times Square at 9:48 p.m. is a sensory assault, a cacophony of yellow cab horns, the rhythmic thrum of bass from a passing slingshot, and the multilingual chatter of 300,000 souls vibrating against the asphalt. But as Officer Miller leaned in, his shoulder brushing against the denim of my jacket, the stadium-sized roar of New York City began to bleed away. It was replaced by a high-pitched, metallic ringing that felt like a needle boring into my skull. I could see the Hamilton billboard towering above fatherduffysquare, a blinding wash of gold and silhouette, casting a prestigious, amber glow over the wet pavement. It promised a story of revolution and legacy, yet here I was, pinned between two badges and 1,000 unblinking smartphone lenses, fighting just to breathe without being accused of a felony. Miller's face was inches from mine. I could see the burst capillaries in his nose, the oily sheen of sweat on his forehead, and the utter lack of empathy in his pale, dilated pupils. He smelled like a toxic mix of Wrigley's spearmint gum and the acidic, burnt plastic scent of precinct coffee. "Resist," he whispered. The word was so soft it was almost intimate, a lover's plea, twisted into a predator's trap. "Please, Zoraide," he continued, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried over the ringing in my ears. "Twitch, pull away. Give me just one tiny reason to put your face into this pavement. I've had a very long shift, and I'd really love to see how much blood that denim jacket can soak up before you stop moving." This was the compliance trap, a psychological weapon I'd read about but never thought I'd experience in the shadow of the Disney store. It's a calculated maneuver where an authority figure uses physical pain and verbal provocation to trigger a human being's natural fight or flight instinct. If I flinched from the pain Thorne was inflicting on my arm, it was resisting. If I tried to pull my ear away from Miller's disgusting breath, it was assaulting an officer. If I cried out, it was disorderly conduct. The system wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to provoke a reaction that justified the use of force. They didn't want my permit. They wanted my submission. I felt Thorne's grip tighten on my left bicep. He wasn't just holding me. He was grinding his thumb into the nerve, a slow, agonizing pressure meant to make my arm go numb and my body buckle. My Juilliard training kicked in, but not in the way I'd expected. I used the breath control I'd mastered for the cello, the deep, diaphragmatic inhalations that kept my bow arm steady during a grueling Shostakovich concerto. I drew the humid, exhaust-heavy air deep into my lungs and held it. I locked my knees. I made my spine a rod of iron. I became a statue of denim and obsidian. The crowd was a blur of neon-lit faces behind their glowing rectangles. They were waiting for the money shot. The moment the girl in the denim jacket finally snapped and the heroic officers had to take her down. I could almost hear the captions being typed. "Busker goes wild in Times Square. Cops take down aggressive soloist." My entire future, the potential audition for the New York Philharmonic, my mother's medical care, my very life, hung on my ability to remain perfectly, agonizingly still. I shifted my gaze. I refused to look at Miller's sneering mouth or Thorne's bulging neck. I looked past them, through the gap between two tourists filming on their iPhone 15 Pros, and locked eyes with the man in the dark trench coat. Shim Baek-du. He hadn't moved an inch since the sirens first broke the rhythm of my cello. While the rest of the world was leaning in, shouting, or filming, he stood with a terrifying, glacial calm. The red glow from the Coca-Cola billboard washed over his face, highlighting the razor-sharp line of his jaw and the deep, bottomless black of his eyes. He wasn't filming. He wasn't shouting. He was observing me with a clinical, detached intensity, as if he were measuring the exact depth of my resolve. He looked at Thorne's hand on my arm. Then back to my eyes. In that split second of eye contact, something shifted. The ringing in my ears didn't stop, but the fear, that cold, paralyzing dread, started to transmute into something else. Baek-du didn't nod. He didn't offer a thumbs up. He simply watched. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being watched by the right person is a form of protection. Miller realized he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. He pulled back just an inch, his eyes narrowing. "What are you looking at, girl? You think someone coming to help you? Look at them." He gestured vaguely at the wall of phones. "They aren't here for you. They're here for the show, and I'm the director." I didn't blink. I didn't speak. I just kept my eyes on the man in the coat. I was Zoraide Vance. I had survived poverty, I had survived Juilliard, and I would survive this humiliation. I was a musician. I knew how to handle a difficult performance. And right now, the entire world was my audience, but Shim Baek-du was the only critic who mattered. "Let's go," Thorne growled, beginning to drag me toward the idling cruiser, its light bar splashing a nauseating rhythm of red and blue across the TKTS steps. "You can explain your art to the desk sergeant." Every step felt like a betrayal of the ground I stood on. Every jerk of Thorne's hand was a reminder of my own powerlessness. But as they pulled me away from the center of the square, I saw Baek-du reach into the pocket of his bespoke trench coat. He didn't pull out a phone to join the fray. He pulled out a sleek, encrypted device that looked more like a weapon than a communication tool. He didn't look away from the officers. He looked like a man who was about to delete a nuisance. If this moment made you feel something, if you're wondering what a man like Shim Baek-du wants with a woman whose world just shattered, subscribe now. This story only gets deeper. The hum of Times Square shifted. It wasn't the rhythmic, commercial hum of a city in motion anymore. It was the predatory vibration of a pack that had found a carcass. I stood there, my biceps screaming under the meat-hook pressure of Officer Thorne's hand, feeling the 92-degree humidity turn into a cold, prickly sweat. The neon lights of the massive H&M and Sephora billboards across the street flickered in my peripheral vision, their polished, artificial beauty mocking the grit of my reality. Then the sound broke. "World Star." The shout came from somewhere behind a wall of tourists. A young guy in a neon green, I Heart NY shirt, holding his iPhone 15 Pro like a weapon. He wasn't just filming, he was framing. He adjusted his stance, trying to get both my terrified face and Thorne's aggressive stance into the same shot. The crowd laughed, not a collective, joyous laugh, but a series of sharp, jagged snickers that cut through the humidity like glass. It was the sound of 300 strangers deciding I wasn't a human being anymore. To them, I wasn't Zoraide Vance, a woman terrified for her livelihood and her mother's medicine. I was a scene. I was a 10-second clip that would be scrolled past between a makeup tutorial and a cat video. I was the morning's entertainment for people who would never know my name. I felt a sickening, hollow sensation in my chest, a stripping of my humanity that felt worse than Thorne's physical grip. I had spent years practicing the cello, pouring my soul into the resonant wood of my 1998 instrument, trying to create something that would make people stop and feel something real. Now, the only thing making them stop was my public degradation. I was being content farmed in the very square where I had dreamed of one day seeing my name on a Broadway marquee. "Look at her face," another voice jeered, a teenager with a gimbal stabilizer weaving through the crowd to get a low-angle shot of my knees as they threatened to buckle. "She's about to cry. This is going to go crazy on TikTok." Every word was a psychological blow. This is the digital coliseum, a modern phenomenon where the crowd no longer demands blood, they demand engagement. They don't intervene because intervention ruins the naturalism of the clip. They don't help because a saved person is a boring video. They needed me to suffer so their followers could react. Officer Thorne sensed the shift in the crowd's energy. He fed on it. He was no longer just a cop, he was a performer. He puffed out his chest, his uniform buttons straining, and looked directly into the nearest lens. He knew the camera didn't care about the truth, it cared about authority. "You see this?" Thorne shouted, addressing the phones rather than me. He pointed his free hand toward my cello case, lying abandoned on the rain-slicked pavement near a puddle of oily water. "This is unauthorized equipment, an obstruction of the public right-of-way. We've had reports of aggressive solicitation in this sector all night." "I wasn't aggressive," I whispered, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "I have my permit. It's in the velvet lining of the case. Please just let me show you." Thorne didn't even look at me. He tightened his grip on my denim jacket, the fabric groaning under the strain. I could feel the cold metal of his handcuffs brushing against my wrist, a silent threat that paralyzed my bow hand, the hand I had spent 20 years perfecting. "You're done talking, Vance," Thorne barked. "We're going to the precinct, and since you want to claim this instrument is so important, we're taking it in as evidence. We need to process it. God knows what else you're hiding in that taped-up box. Drugs, stolen goods." My heart stopped. Evidence. In the legal world, evidence is a black hole for a busker. Once an instrument is processed as evidence in a disorderly conduct or solicitation case, it can sit in a dusty precinct locker for months, or even years, while the bureaucracy grinds. It would be subject to civil asset forfeiture logic, where the state can keep property they claim was used in a crime, even if the person is never convicted. My cello was a 1998 Romanian copy, but it was mine. It was the only thing I had left of my father. If they took it, they weren't just taking wood and strings, they were taking my voice. They were taking my ability to buy my mother's insulin at the Duane Reade on 42nd Street tomorrow morning. "Please," I gasped, the humiliation finally breaking through my stoicism. "Don't take the cello, it's fragile. The humidity, the bridge is already warped. If you put it in a locker, it will crack." Miller, the cop leaning into my ear, let out a low, vibrating chuckle. "Should have thought about that before you decided to play the Swan in a Zone 3 without a sticker, sweetheart. Thorne, let's wrap this up. The crowd is getting restless." The crowd was restless. They were shouting for more. "Tackle her," someone yelled from the back. "Stop resisting," another mocked, though I was as still as a grave. This was the moral misfire. In a crowd this large, a phenomenon called daindividuation takes over. People lose their sense of personal responsibility. They weren't individuals anymore. They were a mob, and the mob wanted a climax. They had no idea that my mother was sitting in a cramped apartment in Washington Heights, counting her last 3 units of insulin. They didn't care that I had been a Juilliard scholarship student until my father's funeral expenses drained the account. They only cared that the blue and red lights looked aesthetic against the red glow of the Coca-Cola sign behind me. Thorne began to drag me. My boots skidded on the wet asphalt, leaving streaks in the grime. He was heading toward the idling Ford Explorer with the New York plates that marked it as a community affairs vehicle, the ultimate irony. I looked back at my cello, lying there like a wounded animal. A tourist stepped on the corner of the case while trying to get a better shot of my face. I heard the faint, sickening crackle of old wood under pressure. And then I saw the shift. Amongst the sea of glowing screens and screaming tourists, the man in the long dark coat, Shim Baek-du, finally moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't reveal his power with a flashy display of violence. He simply took one measured, deliberate step forward. He moved with a heavy, gravitational grace that seemed to push the air out of the way. He didn't look at me. He didn't offer a comforting glance or a nod of reassurance. His eyes remained fixed, but they had shifted targets. He wasn't looking at the officers anymore. He was looking directly into the camera lens of the bystander standing right next to him, the guy in the green shirt who had yelled, "World Star." Baek-du stood so close to the guy's phone that his face must have filled the entire frame. He didn't speak, but the intensity of his gaze was a physical force. The guy with the phone froze. His arm began to shake. The mocking grin slid off his face like melting wax. In that moment, Baek-du wasn't just a spectator. He was a silent judge. He was the one who was truly filming. He was the invisible authority that understood the rules of the Colosseum better than anyone. He knew that in 2026, the only way to stop a digital mob is to make them realize that they, too, are being watched. Thorne didn't see him. He was too busy enjoying his own performance, his hand still clamped on my arm like a vice. He had no idea that his career was already being dismantled by a man who hadn't even opened his mouth. In music, there is a concept called a caesura, a total, breathless silence that breaks a grand orchestral movement. It is a moment where the conductor freezes, the bows hover a millimeter above the strings, and the audience forgets how to exhale. At 9:54 p.m., in the neon-choked heart of Times Square, the world hit a caesura. I was still being dragged. My heels were stuttering against the pavement, leaving faint, dark streaks in the rainwater that pooled near a discarded NY1 newspaper. Officer Thorne's hand was a meat cleaver of pressure on my bicep, and Officer Miller was still grinning, looking at the wall of iPhones like he was waiting for his Emmy nomination. The humidity was a wet blanket, smelling of burnt rubber and the synthetic sweetness of the giant M&M store nearby. Then, a shadow detached itself from the right side of the crowd. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't come in with the frantic energy of a hero. He simply stepped into the frame, moving with a heavy, gravitational grace that seemed to bend the light of the Coca-Cola billboard around him. One moment he was a spectator in a long, dark trench coat. The next, he was an obstacle. Thorne stumbled, his momentum halted by the mere presence of the man standing in his path. The silence that followed was visceral. The tourists lowered their phones by a fraction of an inch. The hecklers who had been screaming "World Star" went quiet. Even the hum of the city, the distant rumble of the N-train beneath our feet and the hiss of taxi tires seemed to retreat into the background. The man in the coat didn't touch the officers. He didn't even raise his hands. He stood perfectly still, his spine a line of tempered steel. The red glow of the neon lights hit the sharp bridge of his nose and the obsidian depth of his eyes, making him look less like a man and more like an ancient, patient statue. "New York Penal Law, Section 240.2, he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the pit of my stomach, the kind of tone a cello makes when the bow is drawn perfectly across the C string. It was calm, clinical, and terrifyingly precise. "Disorderly conduct," the man continued, his eyes locked on Thorne's nameplate, "requires the explicit intent to cause public inconvenience, annoyance, or alarm, or at the very least a reckless creation of a risk thereof. My eyes have been on this woman for 7 minutes. She is standing still. She is packing her equipment. She is silent." He took a half-step closer, his long coat swishing against his boots. "You, however, are currently standing in the center of a designated pedestrian thoroughfare. You are using flashing emergency lights without an active dispatch. You are shouting, attracting a crowd, and physically emptying the flow of traffic. By the letter of the law you just cited, Officer Thorne, you are the ones currently committing disorderly conduct." I felt Thorne's grip loosen just a fraction. It wasn't because he was convinced, it was because he was confused. In the ecosystem of a New York beat cop, there are predators and there are prey. This man didn't fit either category. He didn't smell like fear, and he didn't look like a typical social justice agitator. Thorne blinked, his face flushing a deeper shade of red under the blue strobes of his cruiser. He looked the man up and down. He saw the expensive cut of the trench coat, the polished leather of the boots, and the calm, East Asian features. In Thorne's small, prejudiced mind, the gears began to grind. He didn't see a threat. He saw a generic, wealthy tourist. He saw a man who probably worked in a cubicle and spent his weekends at the MoMA. He saw someone he could bully. Miller, the one who had been whispering in my ear, stepped forward, his hand resting on his utility belt near his taser. "Listen here, Confucius," Miller sneered, his voice dripping with a condescension that made my skin crawl. "This is a police matter. Unless you want to spend the night in a cell for obstruction of justice, I suggest you take your fancy coat and your law degree back to whatever five-star hotel you're staying at." The man, Baek-du, didn't blink. He didn't even look at Miller. His focus remained entirely on Thorne, the man currently holding me. "Section 195.05, Baek-du said quietly. "Obstructing governmental administration. It requires the use of physical force or interference. I am standing on public property, citing public law. I am not touching you. I am merely witnessing you. Are you uncomfortable being witnessed, Officer Thorne? Does the presence of the law make your job more difficult?" The compliance trap had just been turned inside out. Baek-du was using the officers' own tactics against them, staying perfectly calm, speaking in facts, and forcing them to be the ones who escalated. Thorne let out a sharp, jagged bark of a laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He looked at the crowd, then back at Baek-du. To Thorne, this was a joke. He was the one with the badge, the gun, and the city's backing. This man was just a guy in a nice coat. "You're a real philosopher, aren't you?" Thorne said, leaning in until his face was inches from Baek-du's. He let go of my arm, not to free me, but to use his hand to poke Baek-du hard in the center of his chest. "Let me explain how this works in the real world generic tech support. Laws are things I use to keep people like her in line. And people like you are just civilians who watch too many movies." Thorne poked him again, harder this time. "Walk away, now, before I decide that your witnessing is actually a threat to my safety. Unless you want to share a cell with the busker and see how your baritone sounds in a holding tank at the Midtown North Precinct." I felt a surge of genuine terror, not for myself, but for the man in the coat. I saw the iPhones in the crowd lean in. They were smelling blood now. This was the predictability weakness being exploited. In any other video, this is where the hero gets arrested or where he reveals he's a lawyer and starts a long, boring court case. The audience thought they knew how this ended. The cops always win on the street. But they didn't see what I saw. Because I was closer to Baek-du than anyone else. I was standing in the shadow of his coat, and as Thorne poked him for the third time, I saw Baek-du's eyes. They didn't show anger. They didn't show fear. They were a void, a deep, cold, bottomless abyss that suggested he wasn't just a man, he was a consequence. He didn't move to defend himself. He just looked down at the spot on his chest where Thorne's finger had touched the wool. "You shouldn't have done that," Baek-du whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sun will set or the tide will come in. Thorne's sneer didn't waver. "Oh yeah, what are you gonna do, call your manager?" Baek-du didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black device. It wasn't a phone. It had no screen. It had a single silver button on the side. The air in Times Square suddenly felt very, very thin. Officer Thorne just threatened the one man who owns the debt on his precinct's pension fund and the very billboards he stands under. If you want to see arrogance instantly regret its choices, hit the notification bell and subscribe now. This story is about to shift into a gear you won't believe. The air in Times Square didn't just feel heavy anymore. It felt pressurized, like the moments inside a diving bell before the glass begins to spiderweb. I was still caught in the gravitational pull of Officer Thorne's aggression, my arm throbbing where his fingers had dug into the muscle. The blue and red strobes of the cruiser parked illegally on the sidewalk were rhythmic, agonizing pulses of light that made my vision swim. Thorne was still grinning, that jagged, shark-like expression of a man who believes he is the apex predator of the concrete jungle. He had just poked a man who looked like he could buy and sell this entire city block, and he was waiting for the flinch. He was waiting for the stuttered apology, the trembling hands, the frantic reaching for a wallet to show an ID. Thorne lived for the moment a somebody realized they were a nobody in the eyes of the NYPD. But Shim Baek-du didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he slowly raised his left arm. The movement was deliberate, smooth as the neck of my cello. From beneath the sleeve of his dark, charcoal gray wool trench coat, a watch emerged. Even in the chaotic, flickering glow of the Samsung and Coca-Cola billboards, the timepiece was unmistakable. It was a Patek Philippe Nautilus 5711, its blue-ribbed dial catching the neon light like a deep-sea creature. It was a watch that cost more than Thorne's house, more than his entire career's worth of pension. Thorne glanced at it, his sneer faltering for a microsecond as his brain processed the sheer, unadulterated wealth on display. But his arrogance was a thick armor. "Checking the time, Confucius? Is your Uber arriving? Or are you just showing off before I cuff you for being a nuisance?" Baek-du didn't look at Thorne. He looked at the watch. With the index finger of his right hand, he didn't adjust the crown or check the date. He tapped the sapphire crystal face twice, clink, clink. It wasn't a time check. It was a rhythmic command. And then, the world behind him changed. In the previous 10 minutes, I had felt like a piece of meat in a shark tank. The tourists had been a wall of glowing screens and jeering voices, people I'd categorized as the lowest form of modern humanity, the trauma vultures. But as Baek-du tapped his watch, the static of the crowd crystallized into a terrifying, synchronized discipline. To my left, a woman I had thought was just another Midwestern mom in a I Heart NY hoodie suddenly adjusted her stance. She wasn't holding her phone with one hand anymore. She had it locked into a professional-grade stabilizer rig that had been hidden in the folds of her sweatshirt. To my right, a young man in a Yankees cap who had been shouting "World Star" went dead silent. He didn't lower his phone. He raised it higher, and I noticed a small, external microphone clipped to his lapel, aimed directly at Thorne's mouth. They weren't moving like tourists. They were moving like a tactical unit. "What is this?" Miller hissed, his hand hovering over his belt, his eyes darting frantically from one spectator to the next. "Back up! Get those cameras out of our faces. This is an active crime scene." But they didn't back up. They didn't even acknowledge Miller. They remained perfectly, chillingly still, their lenses trained on the officers' badges, their nameplates, and the exact position of Thorne's hand on my bruised arm. "You think you're clever with a little flash mob," Thorne barked, his voice climbing an octave. The pressure on my arm increased, a reflex of fear masked as dominance. "I told you to clear out. This is obstruction. I will start seizing phones." Baek-du finally lowered his arm, the Patek Philippe disappearing back into the shadows of his sleeve. He looked Thorne directly in the eye, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his expression. It wasn't anger. It was pity. "You speak of seizing phones, officer," Baek-du said, his baritone voice slicing through the noise of a passing sightseeing bus. You believe that by taking a device, you take the evidence. You are operating on a 1990s logic in a 2026 reality. He stepped closer. The tourists behind him didn't flinch. They were a phalanx. The devices you see are not recording for TikTok, Baek-du continued. They are not streaming to Instagram or YouTube. There will be no likes for this footage. There will be no shares among the general public. He pointed a long, slender finger toward the woman in the hoodie. She is currently transmitting an uncompressed 4K 60 FPS stream via an encrypted satellite link to a private server hosted in a jurisdiction your subpoenas cannot reach. The metadata is being timestamped and verified by a third-party legal firm in Seoul. The audio, captured by the parabolic microphone on that young man's lapel, is being transcribed in real time by a forensic legal team. I looked at the tourists again. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, suddenly slowed. I looked at the guy in the Yankees cap. His eyes weren't glazed over with the thrill of a viral video. They were cold, professional, and observant. He was a witness in the most literal legal sense of the word. This was the subtle education Baek-du was providing, the brutal reality of the digital age. Most people film police encounters for likes or clout. They want the 15 seconds of fame that comes with a crazy cop video. But those videos are often useless in court. They are edited, they lack context, and the chain of custody is easily challenged by a half-decent union lawyer. But Baek-du wasn't playing the social media game. He was playing the judicial game. When you film for likes, you are the protagonist, Baek-du said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. When you film for evidence, you are a ghost. You are creating a chain of custody that begins the moment your hand touched this woman's arm. There is no delete button for what is happening now, Thorne. Every breath you take, every lie Miller whispers into her ear, is already archived in a vault that will open only when the civil rights suit is filed. Thorne's face went from a flush of red to a sickly, pale gray. He looked at the phones, no longer toys, but black boxes recording his professional execution. He looked at the mom in the hoodie. She didn't look back. She just kept her lens centered on the bruise forming on my skin. This was the moment the power imbalance shifted. Thorne had the badge, the gun, and the law on his side, or so he thought. But Baek-du had the infrastructure. He had the ability to turn a public square into a courtroom before an arrest had even been made. You're interfering, Thorne stammered. The word sounded weak, even to him. He didn't move to arrest anyone. He didn't even move to pull me toward the cruiser. He stood frozen, caught in the crosshairs of a dozen digital eyes that didn't care about his authority. I am educating, Baek-du corrected him. I am showing you the difference between a crowd and a witness. A crowd watches. A witness testifies. And right now, officer, you are giving a very detailed, very public testimony about your own incompetence. The humidity seemed to evaporate. The air felt crisp, cold, and sharp. I looked up at the giant Coca-Cola sign. The red glow felt different now, not like a warning, but like a spotlight. I looked at Baek-du. He hadn't touched anyone. He hadn't raised his voice. But he had just stripped Thorne of his most powerful weapon, the ability to lie about what happened in the dark. But then, the atmosphere shifted again. The invisible power was about to become very visible. Miller, sensing Thorne's collapse, tried to salvage the situation. He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling. "Dispatch! We need additional units at 47th and 7th. We have a hostile crowd and a civilian interfering with an arrest. Priority 1. Baek-du didn't stop him. He didn't even look at him. He just looked at his watch one last time. 10:00 p.m., Baek-du murmured. The shift change. Suddenly, the massive digital billboard above the American Eagle store. A screen that usually showed smiling models in denim went completely black. The silence that followed was terrifying. Officer Thorne just realized he isn't the one in control, but he has no idea how deep the rabbit hole goes. If you want to see what happens when the massive screens of Times Square become a weapon against the people who think they own the streets, hit the notification bell and subscribe now. This story is about to go global. In the city that never sleeps, the most terrifying thing isn't the noise. It's the sudden, absolute death of the light. At exactly 10:01 p.m., the heartbeat of Times Square skipped. It began with the American Eagle billboard, a 4-story-high monster of high-definition denim and curated smiles that loomed directly behind us. The screen didn't just turn off, it shuddered. A jagged line of neon static, a violent electric violet, ripped across the models' faces, and then, with a sound like a distant cannon blast, the entire display went obsidian. A collective gasp, sharp and cold, rippled through the thousands of tourists packed into 7th Avenue. But the darkness was contagious. To my left, the massive curved NASDAQ screen, the tower of wealth that had been scrolling green and red tickers of global dominance, blinked. The glowing blue numbers stuttered, glitched into a series of unreadable hexadecimal codes, and died. One by one, the electronic suns of Midtown were being snuffed out. The Sephora sign, the Disney store display, the shimmering gold of the Hamilton marquee. It was as if New York City had closed its eyes. The only lights left were the pathetic, stuttering blue and red strobes of Officer Thorne's cruiser, reflecting off the wet pavement like a cheap disco in a graveyard. The lack of ambient light made the police strobes feel violent, invasive. They didn't represent safety anymore. They looked like the dying pulses of a trapped animal. "What the hell?" Thorne's voice was no longer a bark. It was a thin, reedy sound, strained by the sudden vacuum of noise and light. His hand, still clamped on my arm, began to tremble, just a microscopic vibration, but to me it felt like an earthquake. "Power surge," Miller stammered, his eyes darting toward the blacked-out sky. "Thorne, we need to get her in the car and get out of here. Something's wrong with the grid." I looked at Shim Baek-du. He hadn't moved. He stood in the center of the dark square like a shadow that had finally found its home. The lack of light didn't hide him. It seemed to accentuate the terrifying stillness of his posture. He wasn't looking at the dead screens. He was looking at Thorne with the patient, detached curiosity of a scientist watching a virus die in a petri dish. "The grid is fine, Officer Miller," Baek-du said. His baritone was the only sound in the square now, amplified by the eerie silence of the stalled traffic. "The city is breathing perfectly. It is only the narrative that is changing." Then the screens breathed back to life. But they didn't return to denim ads or stock tickers. A low-frequency hum, a sound so deep it made my teeth ache, vibrated through the pavement. On the massive NASDAQ screen, a logo appeared. It wasn't the logo of a bank or a tech giant. It was a series of white, technical text overlays against a black background. "Remote access granted. Midtown North Precinct, vendor. Axon Enterprise streaming. BODYCAM 8942, Officer KTHORNE." My breath hitched. I knew that name. I knew that number. I looked at Thorne's chest. The small, circular lens of his Axon bodycam was glowing with a tiny, malevolent green light I hadn't noticed before. "No," Thorne whispered, the color draining from his face until he was the color of unbaked dough. "No, that's a secure server. That's encrypted. You can't." "Everything is a secure server," Baek-du replied, his voice cool and terrifyingly casual, "until someone decides it is no longer in their interest for it to be secure. Your precinct's vendor uses a third-party cloud contractor. That contractor's debt was purchased by my holding company at 11:39 p.m. this afternoon. Technically, officer, I am not hacking. I am simply reviewing my own digital assets. Suddenly, the NASDAQ screen exploded into 4K resolution. The crowd, the thousands of people who had been filming me for TikTok, the people who had been yelling "World Star," simultaneously turned their heads. They looked up at the 5-story tall display, and they saw themselves. But they didn't see the heroic version. They saw the perspective of the bully. The footage was raw, wide-angled, and sickeningly clear. Because it was Thorne's POV, the screen was filled with me. I saw my own face, twisted in a mask of terror and confusion. I saw the way my denim jacket was bunched up under his massive, meaty hand. But more importantly, the camera showed what the crowd couldn't see from the outside. In hyper-realistic detail, the massive screen showed Thorne's hand. It showed the white-knuckle force he was applying. It showed the way his thumb was intentionally grinding into the soft tissue of my bicep, a deliberate pain compliance technique used when there was no resistance to comply with. On the 50-foot screen, my skin looked like a map of trauma, turning a sickening, mottled purple under the pressure of his grip. Then the audio kicked in. The Square's public address system, usually reserved for emergency alerts and New Year's Eve countdowns, crackled to life. "Resist, please. Give me a reason to put you on the pavement." Miller's whisper, which had been meant only for my ear, roared through the canyons of Midtown. It was deafening. It was undeniable. It was the sound of a system unmasked. The power reversal was instantaneous. It was a physical shift in the air pressure. The crowd didn't laugh this time. The tourists didn't jeer. A profound, heavy silence fell over Times Square, the silence of 1,000 people realizing they were witnessing a crime, not a show. The people who had been filming me for content suddenly looked down at their own phones with a sense of visceral shame. They realized they weren't the directors of this movie. They were the extras in a snuff film of a woman's dignity. Thorne's hand dropped from my arm as if I were made of white-hot iron. He stumbled back, his boots splashing into a puddle, his eyes fixed on the giant version of his own hand on the NASDAQ screen. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He looked like a man who had realized he was standing naked in front of the entire world. "Turn it off," Thorne screamed, turning toward Baek-du, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. "I wouldn't do that, officer," Baek-du said, his voice sharpening into a blade. "Look at the screen above the American Eagle store." Thorne spun around. That screen had come back too. It showed a different angle. It was the CCTV feed from the street-level security camera of the Disney store. It showed Thorne and Miller approaching me while I was packing up. It showed me holding my permit out. It showed Thorne swatting it out of my hand and kicking my cello case toward the gutter. It was the God's eye view. It was the truth, stripped of police report adjectives and qualified immunity excuses. "You see, Officer Thorne," Baek-du said, stepping into the circle of blue light, "the problem with the compliance trap is that it only works when the lights are low and the witnesses are cowards. But I have turned Times Square into a courtroom. And currently, every news agency from NY1 to the BBC is pulling this feed from the NASDAQ server. You aren't just losing your job. You are losing your anonymity. You are losing the shield of the badge." I stood there, my arm throbbing, the cool night air hitting the spot where Thorne's hand had been. I felt a strange, dizzying sense of vertigo. 5 minutes ago, I was a nobody being erased by the city. Now, my pain was the most visible thing in the Western Hemisphere. The psychology of the square had flipped. The mob was no longer hungry for my humiliation. They were hungry for his. A low murmur began to build from the crowd, a dark, rhythmic sound. "Shame," a voice called out. "Shame," another joined. Within seconds, the word was a chant, a heartbeat, a roar that drowned out the hum of the city. "Shame, Shame, shame. Thorne looked at Miller. Miller looked at the ground. They were two men in blue uniforms, surrounded by 1,000 cameras and a 100-foot-tall broadcast of their own cruelty. They were no longer the law. They were the evidence. I looked at Baek-du. He wasn't chanting. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching the screens with a look of intense, clinical satisfaction. He hadn't used a gun. He hadn't used his fists. He had used the one thing more powerful than violence in the 21st century. He had used the light. He had weaponized the very thing that makes Times Square what it is, the inescapable, blinding power of being seen. But as the chant reached a fever pitch, I noticed something on the corner of the NASDAQ screen. A new window opened. A live feed of a black SUV, a Genesis G90, turning the corner onto 7th Avenue, led by a phalanx of motorcycles. The invisible power was no longer invisible. The cavalry hadn't come for the cops. They had come for the man in the trench coat. The blackout was over, but for Officer Kalen Thorne, the darkness was just beginning. Have you ever wanted to see a bully shrink in real time under the weight of his own actions? If you believe dignity is a human right, and that sunlight is the best disinfectant, smash that like button and subscribe right now. The reckoning has arrived. There is a specific sound that a city makes when it is about to witness a collision of worlds. It isn't the sound of a crash. It is the sound of a sudden, unnatural silence. At 10:05 p.m., the relentless mechanical heartbeat of 7th Avenue simply stopped. The cacophony of yellow cab horns, the hiss of hydraulic bus brakes, and the rhythmic thrum of the city's exhaust fans were severed. The gridlock wasn't caused by a fender bender or a red light. It was caused by the presence of something that commanded the asphalt. Approaching from 42nd Street, cutting through the shadows of the Knickerbocker Hotel, was a vehicle that looked less like a car and more like a statement of war. It was a black Genesis G90 sedan, its metallic flake paint so deep and polished that it seemed to absorb the neon glare of the square rather than reflect it. It didn't have the garish, light bar-heavy profile of the NYPD Ford Explorers. It moved with the silent, predatory grace of a shark gliding through a coral reef. It was followed by 4 dark SUVs. Moving in a perfect diamond formation, their tires whispering against the wet pavement. The traffic didn't just move for them, it seemed to shrink away. Cab drivers who usually screamed at a pigeon were suddenly still, their hands gripping their steering wheels as they watched the procession pass. This wasn't a police escort. This was something higher up the food chain. I felt the vibration in the soles of my boots before I heard the engine. Officer Thorne felt it too. He was still standing 5 feet away from me, his face a mottled, sickly gray under the blue strobe of his own cruiser. He kept looking up at the NASDAQ screen, where his own hand was still projected in 4K resolution, frozen in the act of bruising my arm, and then back at the approaching sedan. The Genesis didn't pull over to the curb. It stopped dead in the middle of the intersection, perpendicular to Thorne's cruiser, effectively corking the bottle of Times Square. The door didn't open immediately. For 30 seconds, a lifetime in the middle of Manhattan, the car just sat there, its tinted windows an impenetrable void. Then the rear door hissed open. A woman stepped out. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She was wearing a bespoke, charcoal-colored suit tailored so sharply it could have cut paper. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, light-reflecting bun, and her heels made a rhythmic, authoritative click against the asphalt that sounded like a hammer cocking. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like an executioner. In her hand, she held a slim, silver smartphone. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the giant screens displaying Thorne's shame. She didn't even look at me. She walked straight toward Officer Miller. Miller, who had been trying to hide behind the open door of the cruiser, instinctively reached for his holster. "Stay back," he shouted, but his voice cracked, betraying the terror of a man who realized his badge was no longer a shield. "This is an active police perimeter. Return to your vehicle." The woman didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She stopped exactly 2 feet from Miller, her expression as cold as the LED billboards above us. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice clear and devoid of any regional accent, the voice of high-level boardrooms and crisis management. "I am Sarah Min, Chief Legal Counsel for the Shim Group." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't ask for permission. She simply extended her hand and held the silver phone out toward him. The screen was active. "It's the commissioner," she said. The name hit the air like a lead weight. Miller froze. His hand stayed on his belt, but his fingers went limp. The commissioner," Miller stammered. "Which commissioner?" "There is only one who matters on a night like this," Sarah Min replied, her eyes flicking toward the NASDAQ screen. "He has been watching the live feed for the last 4 minutes. He is currently sitting in his office at one police plaza, and he is watching the NYPD's reputation dissolve in real time under the red glow of a Coca-Cola sign. He would like a word." Miller looked at Thorne. Thorne looked at the phone as if it were a live grenade. This was the authority misfire, the most brutal psychological pivot a bully can experience. For the last 10 minutes, Thorne and Miller had operated under the assumption that they were the highest power on the street. They believed their union, their precinct commander, and the blue wall of silence would protect them from the consequences of their cruelty. They thought they were the state. But they had forgotten that the state is a political animal, and political animals fear one thing above all else: bad optics. By turning Times Square into a global courtroom, Shim Baek-du hadn't just exposed a crime. He had made the police department a liability to the people who ran it. He had overridden the local authority of the badge with the global authority of money and political pressure. Thorne's protection hadn't just been breached, it had been dismantled by his own boss. Miller's hand shook as he reached out and took the phone. He pressed it to his ear, his shoulder hunched, his eyes fixed on the pavement. "Sir," Miller whispered. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I saw the color drain from Miller's neck. His jaw went slack. He stood there, nodding periodically, his posture collapsing until he looked like a schoolboy being scolded in the principal's office. "Yes, sir," Miller said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "I understand, yes. We are releasing the subject immediately. No, sir, we haven't. No, yes, sir." He handed the phone back to Sarah Min with a trembling hand. He didn't look at her. He turned toward Thorne. "Kaylin," Miller said, his voice hollow. "Let her go, now." Thorne didn't move. He was staring at the Genesis G90, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and utter soul-crushing realization. He realized he had been sacrificed. He realized that the man in the dark trench coat, the man he had poked in the chest, the man he had called generic tech support, wasn't just a witness. He was a god in this ecosystem, and Thorne had just tried to arrest a god's interests. "They can't do this," Thorne hissed, though it sounded more like a plea than a defiance. "She was solicitation. She didn't have the permit. I was doing my job." "Your job just ended, Kaylin," Miller whispered, stepping toward him. "The commissioner is on his way to a press conference. Internal Affairs is already at the precinct. If you don't let her go right now, they aren't just going to fire you. They're going to feed you to the wolves." I stood there, my arms still burning, watching the 2 men who had tried to erase me fall apart in front of 1,000 cameras. I looked at Shim Baek-du. He was still leaning against the bollard, his hands in his pockets, watching the scene with a terrifying, glacial calm. He hadn't said a word to the commissioner. He didn't have to. His presence was the pressure. Sarah Min walked over to me. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She simply looked at my arm, where the bruise was already beginning to bloom in shades of violent plum and blue. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "My name is Sarah. We are going to take care of you now. Please step toward the vehicle." I looked at my cello case, still lying in the grime of the gutter. Sarah noticed. She gestured to one of the men in the dark suits who had emerged from the SUVs. He didn't just pick it up. He lifted it as if it were a religious artifact, wiping the grime from the case with a microfiber cloth before carrying it toward the Genesis. I walked past Thorne. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The look on his face as I was escorted into the back of a $250,000 car while he stood in the rain of his own making was more satisfying than any insult I could have hurled. As the heavy, soundproof door of the Genesis closed, the roar of Times Square vanished. It was replaced by the scent of expensive leather and the quiet, high-tech hum of a cabin designed to keep the world at bay. I looked out the tinted window. I saw the massive NASDAQ screen flicker. The image of Thorne's hand disappeared. It was replaced by a single, elegant logo, the Shim Group. The authority misfire was complete. The bully was gone. The god had arrived. If you're wondering what it feels like to watch a bully realize they picked a fight with a god, subscribe now. This story is no longer about a busker in the street. It's about the total dismantling of a corrupt empire. We are about to witness the takedown. Hit that notification bell. The next chapter changes everything. Gravity returned to Times Square with the force of a physical blow. The moment Miller finished that phone call, his hand didn't just let go of my arm. It recoiled. He pulled his fingers away as if my denim jacket had suddenly reached several thousand degrees Fahrenheit. I stumbled, my knees, which had been locked in a desperate, trembling defiance for the last 15 minutes, nearly giving out. I felt the blood rush back into my hand. It was a sickening, prickling sensation, thousands of tiny needles of oxygenated life fighting through the bruised tissue. I clutched my left bicep with my right hand, feeling the heat of the trauma under the fabric. My arm felt heavy, alien, like a piece of wood attached to my shoulder. We, Miller began. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He looked at the phones, then at the black Genesis, then at the massive NASDAQ screen which had now switched to a looping, silent image of the Shim Group's silver logo. The arrogance that had defined his posture, the puffed-out chest, the hand on the taser, the sneer, was gone. In its place was the raw, naked fear of a man who realized he had accidentally stepped on a landmine while wearing a paper suit. "We were following procedure," Miller stammered, his eyes darting toward the crowd. "It's a high-traffic zone, public safety. We have to maintain the flow." "Flow," a voice cut through his stutter. Shim Baek-du finally moved. Until now, he had been a stationary force, a pillar of dark wool and silent authority on the edge of the frame. But now, he stepped forward. He closed the gap between us in 3 measured, terrifyingly calm strides. In the image captured by 1,000 cameras that night, this was the moment the observer became the executioner. He stood so close to Thorne and Miller that I could see the reflection of the blue police strobes in the polished silver buttons of his trench coat. Baek-du didn't look at me. He looked at Thorne, who was still frozen, his jaw working silently like a fish out of water. "Procedure," Baek-du repeated. He spoke the word like it was something filthy he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "You find comfort in that word, don't you? You believe that procedure is a magic spell that grants you immunity from the basic laws of human decency." He stepped even closer, his shadow falling over Thorne's badge. "Let us discuss the actual procedure," Baek-du said, his baritone voice dropping into a register that made the very air vibrate. "Under 42 U.S. Code Section 1983, anyone who, under color of any statute or ordinance, subjects a citizen to the deprivation of any rights secured by the Constitution is liable to the party injured. You didn't just maintain flow, officer. You committed a premeditated assault on a peaceful citizen to provoke a reaction you could then monetize into an arrest. You attempted to seize property, that cello, without a warrant or probable cause, a direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. Thorne finally found his voice, though it sounded like it was being squeezed through a straw. I have a right to defend my safety. She was non-compliant. She was a statue, Baek-du snapped. The sharpness of his tone made Thorne flinch. The only thing non-compliant about her was her refusal to scream while you bruised her. And you, Officer Thorne, are currently being witnessed by approximately 4 million people via the live streams my team has stabilized and mirrored across every major social platform. The blue wall cannot hide a man standing in a 4K spotlight. Baek-du checked his Patek Philippe one more time. The sapphire crystal caught the gold light of the Hamilton sign. It is currently 10:14 p.m., Baek-du stated. You have exactly 30 seconds to do two things. First, you will offer a formal, audible apology to Ms. Vance for the physical harm and the unlawful detention you have subjected her to. Second, you will vacate this square. You will leave the cruiser. You will walk away. Miller's eyes went wide. Leave the car. We can't leave a department vehicle in the middle of 7th Avenue. 30 seconds, Baek-du interrupted, his voice as cold as the Hudson in January. If, by the time the clock hits 10:15, you are still standing here, my legal team will not file a suit against the city. We will not file a suit against the NYPD. We will file a monal claim directly targeting the assets of your specific police union. I will dedicate the next 10 years of my life and $50 million of my personal liquidity to ensuring that your union's pension fund is liquidated to pay for the civil rights violations you committed tonight. I will make you the reason your fellow officers can no longer afford to retire. The authority misfire was now a total meltdown. This was the masterstroke. Baek-du knew that the city would usually pay out a settlement for police brutality using taxpayer money. The cops never felt the sting. But by threatening the union's actual coffers, he was turning every other cop in the city against Thorne and Miller. He was making them pariahs. Miller looked at Thorne. He looked like he wanted to cry. The tourists were no longer content farming. They were the jury. The phones were no longer held at hip level. They were thrust forward like spears. Apologize, Miller hissed at Thorne, grabbing his partner's sleeve. Kalen, do it now, the commissioner, the union, do it. Thorne looked at me. For a second, I saw the old embers of his rage, the hatred he felt for a woman who dared to have talent, who dared to occupy space in his square. But then he looked at Baek-du, and he saw a power that didn't care about his badge. He saw a man who could erase his existence with a phone call. Thorne swallowed hard. His throat made a clicking sound. I'm sorry, Thorne muttered, looking at his boots. Louder, Baek-du commanded. The parabolic microphones on 48th Street need to hear the sincerity in your voice. Thorne looked up, his face a mask of pure, concentrated humiliation. I apologize, Ms. Vance, for the misunderstanding and the physical contact. Misunderstanding, I whispered, my voice finally returning. You tried to break my arm, you tried to take my life's work. We're leaving, Miller said, his voice trembling. He didn't even wait for Thorne. He began to back away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender to the cameras. The crowd erupted. It wasn't a cheer of joy, it was a roar of predatory triumph. As the two officers turned and began to push through the throng of people, the tourists didn't step aside easily. They stayed close, their phones inches from the officers' faces, capturing the sweat on their necks, the shame in their eyes. The hunters were now the hunted. "Keep filming," someone yelled. "Look at the camera, Thorne," another jeered. The two men who had controlled the square 10 minutes ago were now scurrying toward 46th Street, leaving their idling cruiser, lights still flashing, like a discarded toy in the middle of the road. I stood by the red steps, the cold air hitting my face, feeling the surreal shift of the universe. I was still Zoraide Vance. I was still poor. My mother still needed medicine. But for the first time in 23 years, the world felt balanced. Baek-du turned to me then. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't smile. He just looked at me with those deep, unreadable eyes. "The 30 seconds are up," he said quietly. "Let us go. New York is a loud place, Ms. Vance. You deserve a moment of silence." He gestured toward the Genesis G90. Sarah Min was already holding the door open. As I walked toward the car, I looked back at the spot where I had been pinned. My cello case was gone, already safe in the trunk. The only thing left was the scatter of $5 bills I'd earned earlier, still lying in the oily puddle. I didn't stop to pick them up. I didn't need them. The man in the trench coat had just given me something much more expensive than money. He had given me my name back. As the car door shut, muffling the roar of the digital Coliseum, I saw the time on the dashboard clock. 10:16 p.m. The longest 19 minutes of my life were over. But as the car pulled away, I realized that for Shim Baek-du, this wasn't an ending. It was an opening move. If you've ever felt invisible in a world full of noise, if you've ever waited for justice that never came, this is for you. Subscribe to this channel to see what happens when the nobodies finally find a voice that the somebodies can't ignore. This story is just getting started. The blue and red strobes of the abandoned police cruiser continued to pulse, casting rhythmic, jagged shadows against the wet walls of the TKTS steps. But the lights felt different now. Without the men who wore the badges, the sirens were just empty noise, a flickering neon ghost of an authority that had been utterly dismantled in less than 20 minutes. I stood by the open door of the Genesis G90, my hand still clutching my left bicep. The pain was shifting from a sharp, electric sting to a deep, heavy throb, the kind of ache that settles into the bone. I could feel the heat radiating through my denim jacket, a localized fever where Thorne's fingers had been. Across the pavement, Officers Thorne and Miller were retreating. They weren't walking, they were scurrying. Miller was leading the way, his head ducked low, his hands shielding his face from the wall of smartphones that followed them like a swarm of digital hornets. Thorne moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, his shoulders hunched as if he expected a physical blow to land at any moment. The crowd, the same crowd that had been laughing and shouting, "World Star," just moments ago, had undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. They were no longer spectators at a hanging, they were the executioners. "Yeah, keep running," a man in a tourist fleece screamed, thrusting his phone within inches of Thorne's ear. "We got you on 4K, you bully, you're done." "How's that pension looking now, Thorne?" A girl in a crop top jeered, her gimbal stabilizer tracking his every stumble. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a tidal wave of vindictive joy. They were cheering for me, yes. But I could feel the hollowness of it. These were the same people who would have watched me be tackled to the ground if the script had gone the other way. Their loyalty wasn't to justice, it was to the winner. In the digital Coliseum, the mob only loves the person who holds the sword, and right now, the sword belonged to the man standing next to me. Shim Baek-du didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the cheers, the whistles, or the people calling out his name, or whatever version of hero they had assigned to him. To him, the thousands of people packed into fatherduffysquare didn't exist. He stood with his back to the neon chaos, his gaze fixed entirely on me. He didn't smile. A smile would have felt like a lie, a cheap social lubricant for a situation that was still vibrating with trauma. His face remained a mask of glacial, expensive composure. 10:19 p.m., he said softly, his baritone voice barely audible over the roar of the mob, yet it cut through the noise like a cello's C-string. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal trench coat. He didn't pull out a phone or a weapon. He pulled out a small, rectangular piece of cardstock. He held it out to me between two fingers. I took it with my shaking right hand. The card was heavy, thick 600 GSM cotton paper with a texture like fine linen. There was no logo, no flashy gold foil, just a single name embossed in a deep, matte black ink, Shim Baek-du. Beneath it, a single international phone number. The simplicity was the ultimate flex. It was the business card of a man who didn't need to explain who he was because if you had the card, you already knew. "Ms. Vance," he said, his eyes scanning my face, settling for a second on the way I was shielding my arm. "The physical tissue will heal. The state of New York will be made to pay for the medical imaging and the physical therapy required to ensure your bow arm suffers no permanent degradation. My legal team will see to the filings by 9:00 a.m. I looked down at the card, the matte ink catching the red glow of the Coca-Cola sign. "Why?" I whispered. My voice felt like it was coming from a long way off, cracked and dry. "Why did you stop? You could have just walked past. Everyone else was just filming." Baek-du didn't blink. "The compliance trap only functions because of a vacuum of accountability. Most people film because they want to witness a tragedy. I do not find tragedy entertaining. I find inefficiency offensive. A system that destroys a talent like yours over a permit is an inefficient system." He paused, his gaze shifting to the trunk of the Genesis where his man had placed my cello. "Your instrument," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, a hint of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just a collector's concern for a rare asset. "A 1998 Romanian build. Taped at the bouts, the bridge is leaning 3 degrees to the left. It was struck during the altercation." I felt a fresh spike of panic. I turned toward the car. "The bridge, if it snapped." "Is it repairable?" Baek-du asked. I reached out with my good hand and touched the cold, polished fender of the G90. I thought about the wood, the way it vibrated against my chest when I played the opening notes of Cello Suite No. 1. I thought about the way it smelled of old rosin and my father's woodshop. I think so," I said, my fingers trembling. I touched my arm again, feeling the swell of the bruise. The skin felt tight like a drumhead stretched too far. "The wood is old, it's resilient, but the sound might never be the same. It remembers when it's been hurt." "Everything remembers," Baek-du replied. He stepped closer, closing the final bit of space between us. For the first time, I felt the sheer, magnetic heat of his presence. He smelled of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and the ozone of a thunderstorm. He was the most dangerous thing in Times Square, yet he was the only thing making me feel safe. "Dignity is not a feeling, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic vibration. "It is property. It is something you own. Those men tried to steal your property because they assumed you didn't have the means to defend the title. They were mistaken." He looked up at the NASDAQ screen one last time. The Shim Group logo was still there, a silver sentinel over the crossroads of the world. "The cello will be sent to a luthier in Cremona," Baek-du stated. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order of the universe. "In the meantime, you will be provided with an 18th century testor from my private collection. You have a performance at the end of the month. You will not miss it." I stared at him, my mouth agape. A testor, an 18th century masterpiece worth more than the entire block we were standing on. "I can't. I don't even know you," I stammered. "You know my name," he said, gesturing to the card in my hand. "And I know your value. That is the only contract that matters in this city." He turned toward the open door of the car. Sarah Min was standing there, a silent shadow of efficiency. "Get in, Ms. Vance," Baek-du said. "The ice is waiting for your arm, and the world is waiting for your music." I took a breath, a real breath, the first one since 9:47 p.m. The air still tasted like exhaust and roasted nuts, but the high-pitched ringing in my ears had finally stopped. I looked at the retreating blue lights of the cruiser, now blocks away, and then I stepped into the dark, leather-scented sanctuary of the Genesis. As the door clicked shut, the roar of the crowd was instantly severed. The silence was absolute. The dignity had been restored, but as I looked at the man in the trench coat through the tinted glass, I realized that the price of that restoration was that I was now part of his world. And in Baek-du's world, there are no nobodies, only assets and enemies. If you've ever felt invisible in a world full of noise, if you've ever waited for a justice that never came, this story is for you. We just watched Zoraide Vance go from a victim to a protege. But what does a mafia boss want with a cellist? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to find out. The final chapter is coming, and it will change everything. The silence was the first luxury I truly noticed. Inside the back of the Genesis G90, the world had been reduced to the soft, rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt and the faint, cool scent of leather. By the time the car glided to a stop on 52nd Street, the sensory violence of Times Square felt like a fever dream, a nightmare of red neon and blue strobes that had happened to someone else in another life. We weren't at a police precinct. We weren't at a hospital. We were parked in front of a nondescript, charcoal-painted storefront with a single, warm yellow light illuminating a wooden sign. Tsuru. "We are here," Sarah Min said softly, opening the door for me. I stepped out, my legs still feeling like they were made of water. My left arm was wrapped in a professional-grade cold compress that Sarah had produced from a hidden compartment in the car. The swelling was being kept at bay, but the deep, throbbing ache remained, a physical record of Officer Thorne's malice. Shim Baek-du was already standing on the sidewalk. He had shed his long trench coat, revealing a charcoal silk shirt that moved like water over his frame. Without the coat, he looked less like a shadow and more like a man, though the sheer gravity of his presence hadn't diminished. He gestured toward the door. Inside, the ramen bar was empty of customers, but the air was thick with the comforting, savory steam of bone broth and ginger. There were no flashing screens here, no tourists, just the low, amber glow of pendant lamps and the rhythmic sound of a chef's knife hitting a cutting board in the back. Baek-du seated himself at the far end of the polished cedar bar. He didn't wait for me to join him, but he left the stool next to him open. I sat down cautiously, my bruised arm resting on the cool wood. "The chef is a friend," Baek-du said, his voice regaining that low, resonant baritone that had commanded the square. "He understands that tonight we require more than just sustenance. We require peace." He turned to look at me then. Up close, away from the neon glare, I could see the fine lines around his eyes, not from age, but from a lifetime of scrutiny. "I suppose you have questions," he said. "I have 1,000, I replied, my voice steadier than it had been all night. "Starting with, who are you, and why were you standing there in the middle of a Tuesday night watching a busker get her life ruined?" Baek-du didn't answer immediately. He waited as the chef placed 2 bowls of tonkatsu ramen in front of us, the steam rising in swirling white ghosts. "I am Shim Baek-du," he began. "I am the chairman of the Shim Group. To the newspapers, I am a media conglomerate head. To the city, I am the man who owns the digital skin of Times Square. The screens, the servers, The data pipelines that feed the billboards you saw tonight. He picked up a pair of dark, lacquered chopsticks. I was in the square because I am a perfectionist, Ms. Vance. I was inspecting a new haptic sync technology on the American Eagle board. I prefer to see my assets with my own eyes rather than through a report. I was expecting to find technical glitches. I did not expect to find a systemic ugliness. He looked at the steam rising from his bowl. I find many things tolerable, inefficiency, ambition, even greed, but I find ugliness offensive. And what those men did to you, the way they used the cover of the law to satisfy a small, pathetic need for dominance, that was the purest form of ugliness I have ever witnessed. It was a glitch in the city I helped build, and I do not allow glitches to remain. I looked at him, truly looked at him. You saved me because you hate glitches. You dismantled two men's lives because they were ugly. I saved you because you refused to break, he corrected. You stood your ground under the compliance trap. You played Bach in a place that only understands noise. You were the only beautiful thing in that square tonight, Ms. Vance. It would have been a waste of resources to let them erase you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a second card. This one was different. It wasn't a business card. It was a small, encrypted thumb drive. Your cello is already in the hands of a master luthier. But as you said, wood remembers. And your arm. It may take time to regain the precision required for the Philharmonic. He pushed the drive toward me. Inside this drive is a full scholarship to Columbia Law. Tuition, housing, and a stipend that will ensure your mother's medical needs are met for the next decade. It is not a gift. It is an investment. I felt the air leave my lungs. Law, I'm a musician, Mr. Shim. I don't know the first thing about being a lawyer. You already know the most important thing, Baek-du said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. You know what it feels like to be on the other side of the compliance trap. You know how the law is used as a weapon of intimidation against those who cannot speak its language. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Music is vital, Zoraide. It heals the soul. It provides the beauty that makes life worth living. But in a world like this, a world of Thorne and Miller, music is not enough. Music heals the soul, but the law protects the body. It is the armor that ensures the music is allowed to play. I looked at the thumb drive, then at my bruised arm. I thought about the tourists and their phones. I thought about the look on Thorne's face when he realized his power was an illusion. You want me to be like you, I said. The invisible power in the coat. I want you to be the one who holds the light, Baek-du replied. So that the next time a woman is standing under those red steps, she doesn't have to wait for a stranger in a trench coat to step into the frame. She will be the frame. The moral of the night finally clicked into place. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It wasn't just about Thorne losing his badge or Miller scurrying into the night. That was just housekeeping. True justice was empowerment. It was the transition from being content for someone else's tick-tock to being the architect of one's own safety. I picked up the thumb drive. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than the cello bow, heavier than the $5 bills I'd left in the gutter. It felt like the future. I'll do it, I said. Baek-du nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Good. The world has enough victims, Zoraide. It needs more witnesses. He went back to his ramen, the conversation over. We sat there in the quiet of 52nd Street, two strangers bonded by 19 minutes of neon-lit trauma and a shared understanding of how power really works. Outside, the city continued to roar. Somewhere, miles away, the NASDAQ screen was probably showing an ad for a new watch or a summer blockbuster. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the noise. I knew the code. I knew the law. and I knew that somewhere in the shadows, someone was always watching. I took a bite of the ramen. It was warm. It was real. And for the first time since 9:47 p.m., it was enough. Zoraide Vance stood her ground, and the universe answered with a power she never expected. If this story of resilience and high-stakes justice moved you, please share it. You never know who is watching or who might be inspired to step into the light. Subscribe now for more stories where justice is served cold and the nobodies finally get the last word. Thank you for being a witness.